Hello, my dear adventurers. It's your lore-keeper, welcoming you back to our cozy haven, where ancient stories unfold and the mists of time part to reveal the chronicles of heroes long past. Tonight, I'm particularly excited to embark on a journey that will carry us through 8,000 years of legend, honor, and winter's unforgiving embrace. We're traveling to the north, to the ancient stronghold of Winterfell, to explore the complete and sweeping history of House Stark, the Kings of Winter, the Wardens of the North, and perhaps the most enduring noble house in all of Westeros. Imagine with me, if you will, the vast and frozen expanse of the North. Picture endless forests of sentinel trees, their branches heavy with snow. Envision rugged mountains where the wind howls like a chorus of ancient spirits, and frozen rivers that snake through valleys untouched by southern warmth. Feel the bite of winter air against your face, the crunch of snow beneath your boots, and smell the sharp, clean scent of pine and frost. Here, where summer snows are not uncommon and winter can last a generation, stands Winterfell, an ancient fortress whose foundations were laid in the dawn of history itself. Its grey stone walls have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the march of armies, and the quiet determination of a family whose words echo through the centuries as both warning and promise. Winter is coming. So settle into your most comfortable spot, wrap yourself in warmth, and let us begin at the very beginning, in an age when the world was young and heroes walked the earth. Our story begins more than 8,000 years before the present day, in a time known as the Age of Heroes, when the first men had finally made peace with the children of the forest after centuries of bloody conflict. The world was raw and new, filled with magic and wonder, giants and greenseers, wargs and ancient powers that have since faded from memory. In this primordial age arose a figure whose legacy would echo through the millennia. Brandon Stark, known to history as Bran the Builder, or simply Bran the Builder. The legends surrounding this ancient Brandon are so numerous and grand that many Meisters believe they cannot possibly all be true, that perhaps multiple men named Brandon, or even several generations of Brandons, had their deeds conflated into a single mythological figure. And yet, the tales persist with remarkable consistency across thousands of years. Bran the Builder was said to have been one of the first men who fought in the greatest conflict the world had ever known, the war against the others, those terrible creatures of ice and death who descended from the lands of always winter to bring an endless night upon the world. This conflict, remembered in song and story as the Long Night, was a time of unspeakable horror. The sun hid its face for a generation, or so the stories say. Darkness covered the land, and in that darkness came the others riding their dead, horses bringing with them an army of the risen dead. They swept across the north like a tide of frozen death, their eyes blue as ice, their touch bringing the cold of the grave. Heroes rose to fight them, wielding blades of dragon glass and whatever weapons might harm creatures that were already dead. The children of the forest joined with the first men in this desperate struggle, old enmities forgotten in the face of extinction. According to the ancient tales, it was Bran the Builder who led the combined forces of men and children in the final battles of this terrible war. Some stories claim he was a great warrior who slew others with a blade of dragon glass. Other tales suggest he was a wise leader who united the scattered tribes of the first men and convinced the children to share their magic and knowledge. The truth, if it can be separated from legend at all, likely contains elements of both. What we know with more certainty, is what came after the others were finally driven back into the frozen waste from whence they came. In the aftermath of the long night, Bran the Builder oversaw the construction of the most ambitious project ever attempted in Westeros, the Wall. This massive structure, 300 miles long and 700 feet high in places, was built from ice and stone and, if the legends are true, infused with ancient magic by the children of the forest. Some say giants helped in its construction, using their immense strength to move stones no man could lift. Others claim that the wall is held together not just by ice and mortar, but by spells woven into its very foundation, wards that would keep the others from ever crossing south again. Bran the Builder raised this monument to survival, this barrier between the world of men and the realm of eternal winter, and in doing so, he gave humanity a chance to rebuild, to thrive, to endure. But the wall was not Brandon's only achievement. He also founded the Night's Watch, that ancient brotherhood sworn to guard the realms of men from whatever might come from beyond the wall. He gave them the land south of the wall, a gift known to history as Brandon's gift, to sustain them in their eternal vigil. And in a location whose significance would only grow with the passage of centuries, Bran the Builder raised a great castle and fortress, Winterfell. The very name evokes the victory over winter, the place where winter fell, where the darkness was pushed back and the light of humanity endured. Built with the help of giants, or so the old tales claim, Winterfell rose from the northern earth as a symbol of strength and permanence. Its walls were thick and strong, its towers tall, its godswood ancient and sacred. Beneath the castle, Brandon excavated vast crypts where the dead could rest, surrounded by darkness and stone, watched over by stone wolves and their rusted iron swords. These crypts would eventually stretch deep into the earth, level upon level descending into shadow, housing generation after generation of stark dead. From this fortress, from this seat of power carved from stone and determination, Bran the Builder established House Stark. The direwolf became their sigil, that great beast of the north, fierce and loyal, running grey against a field of white. Their words, simple and stark like the men who spoke them, were not a boast of power or a claim to greatness, but a warning, a reminder of reality. Winter is coming. And so House Stark was born, not in conquest or ambition, but in survival and duty, in the grim determination to endure whatever darkness might come. The early Starks ruled from Winterfell, but they were not yet the undisputed masters of the North. The lands that would eventually bow to the kings of winter were in those early days divided among many petty kingdoms, each with their own kings and lords, each jealous of their independence and power. The Barrow kings ruled from their great burial mounds in what would become the Barrowlands. The Red Kings of House Bolton held sway from their fortress of the Dreadfort, a place already gaining a dark reputation for the cruelties practiced within its walls. The Marsh Kings ruled the swamps and wetlands of the Neck. The Warg King commanded Sea Dragon Point, with an army that included not just men but beasts under the control of skin changers. The Kings of Winter were but one power among many, rulers of Winterfell and its immediate surroundings, but nothing more. Yet from these humble beginnings would grow an empire, and the descendants of Bran the Builder would not rest until all the North knelt before the direwolf throne of Winterfell. The transformation of House Stark from minor kings to masters of the entire North took thousands of years and was written in blood and marriage, in conquest and alliance, in unwavering determination. The early kings of winter were not the honourable lords we might imagine from later ages. They were warriors and conquerors, fierce and often cruel, willing to do whatever was necessary to expand their power and bring the fractious North under their control. The first great enemies of House Stark were the Barrow Kings, that ancient dynasty that ruled the Barrowlands and styled themselves kings of the first men. The conflict between Winterfell and the Barrowlands would last so long that singers called it the 1,000 Years' War, though runic evidence suggests it was actually a series of wars spanning perhaps 2 centuries. The Barrow Kings were proud and powerful, ruling from their great earthen mounds where their dead lay in splendor. They commanded the loyalty of many lesser lords and held vast territories south of Winterfell. The wars between the Starks and the Barrow Kings were brutal affairs, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage for generations. Armies marched across the Barrowlands, burning and pillaging. The Starks would win victories, pushing south, only to be pushed back in the next generation. The Lyceum Barrow Kings would raid north, burning steadings and villages, only to retreat when winter came and made campaigning impossible. This went on, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, until finally, in a conflict whose details have been lost to time, the last Barrow King was defeated. The end came not with total destruction, but with submission and alliance. The Barrow King bent the knee, acknowledging the superiority of the Kings of Winter, and to cement this new peace, he gave his daughter's hand in marriage to the Stark King. Through this union of blood, the Barrowlands were brought under Winterfell's dominion, and the first great step in unifying the North was complete. The Barrow Kings became vassals, and over time, their line would dwindle and fade, their power absorbed into the growing might of House Stark. But if the Barrow Kings represented the Starks' longest conflict, House Bolton represented their most dangerous enemy. From their castle of the Dreadfort on the eastern reaches of the north, the Red Kings of House Bolton carved out their own kingdom of fear and blood. The Boltons were known even then for their practice of flaying their enemies, a tradition so horrifying that when the Starks finally defeated them, one of the first edicts was to outlaw this barbaric custom. Yet even outlawed, the Boltons would continue their dark practices in secret, and the enmity between the direwolf and the flayed man would never truly die. The wars between Stark and Bolton raged for centuries. Each house won victories and suffered defeats. The Red Kings proved to be cunning and ruthless opponents, willing to use treachery and terror to achieve their ends. Stories tell of Bolton kings would wear the skins of their enemies, including Stark kings, as cloaks, a practice so vile it lives in infamy even in distant ages. One tale speaks of a siege of the Dreadfort that lasted 2 years, until a king of winter named Harlan Stark starved out the Boltons and forced their submission. Eventually, through a combination of military superiority and perhaps exhaustion on both sides, the Red Kings were brought to heel. They bent the knee and became vassals of Winterfell, but they never forgot their former royal status. The Boltons would remain one of the most powerful houses in the north, always dangerous, always watched, their loyalty never entirely trusted. The prohibition against flaying would be one of the most visible signs of Stark dominance, though whispers would persist through the ages that, in the dark dungeons of the Dreadfort, the old ways continued in secret. Beyond the Barrow Kings and the Red Kings, the Starks faced and defeated a score of other petty kingdoms. The Warg King of Sea Dragon Point commanded an army of beasts and skin changers, men who could slip into the minds of wolves and eagles and other creatures. According to documents preserved at the Night Fort, a king of winter killed the War King, along with his sons, his beasts, and his greenseers, and took the War King's daughters as prizes, perhaps to gain their magical bloodlines for House Stark. This dark tale, if true, might explain the gift for warging that would occasionally appear in the Stark line over the following millennia. The Marsh Kings ruled the swamps and bogs of the Neck until King Rickard Stark defeated them in battle, and then sealed the conquest by marrying the Marsh King's daughter. Through this marriage, the Neck was brought under Winterfell's authority, and the Marsh King's vassals, including House Reed, became sworn to the Starks. The Reeds would prove to be among the most loyal of all northern houses, maintaining their allegiance through every subsequent age. One by one, the petty kingdoms fell. House Greenwood, House Towers, House Amber, House Frost, and a score of lesser houses whose very names have been lost to history were all defeated, absorbed, or destroyed. Some were conquered by force of arms. Others were brought into the fold through marriage alliances. Still others simply faded away, their lines dying out or their power waning, until they had no choice but to seek protection from the kings of winter. By the time the Andals began their invasion of Westeros thousands of years later, the North had been unified under the rule of House Stark. During this long age of consolidation, several kings of winter earned particular renown. King Jon Stark drove raiders from the White Knife River and built the Wolf's Den at its mouth as a fortress to protect the eastern coast. This stronghold would often be granted to younger sons or grandsons of the king in the north, and one such cadet branch, the Grey Starks, would rule it for many years before being extinguished, after they foolishly allied with the Boltons against the main Stark line. King Theon Stark, who would be remembered as a fierce and capable war leader, made common cause with House Bolton to defeat an Andal invasion at the Battle of the Weeping Water. After this victory, Theon did something extraordinary. He built a fleet, sailed across the narrow sea to Andalos itself, the homeland of the Andals, and took revenge by sacking their settlements and putting hundreds to death. He also conquered the Three Sisters, those rocky islands in the Bight, attacked the Fingers, and fought against the Ironborn raiders who constantly plagued the North's western coast. Theon drove them from Cape Kraken and Bear Island, slaying Ravos Hor in the process, and thereby earned himself a place in northern song and legend. The conquest of Bear Island would lead to one of the more colourful tales in Stark history. King Roderick Stark won the island from the Ironborn, not through battle, but through a wrestling match, or so the story goes. After defeating the Ironborn champion, Roderick granted Bear Island to House Mormont, establishing them as one of his vassals. The Mormonts would prove to be fierce and loyal bannermen, the women of their house becoming particularly renowned as warriors, equally capable with sword and spear as any man. Throughout these centuries of warfare and consolidation, the kings of winter maintained a close relationship with the Night's Watch and the Wall. Many younger sons and brothers of the Stark kings joined the Watch, and several of the youngest men ever to serve as Lord Commander were members of House Stark. The Watch was not yet seen as a dumping ground for criminals and broken men, but as an honourable calling, and the Starks ensured that the Watch was supplied and supported. This tradition of support would continue through every age of Stark rule. Yet not all the stories from this era are tales of warfare and conquest. One of the most famous legends concerns a king in the north named Brandon Stark and a wildling raider called Bael the Bard. According to the tale, Bael came south of the Wall and infiltrated Winterfell disguised as a travelling bard, when Lord Brandon insulted him, calling him a coward, Bael took his revenge by abducting Brandon's only daughter during the night. The Starks searched everywhere for the girl, never finding her, until one day she returned to Winterfell carrying a baby boy. The child was Bael's son, but he was also Brandon's only heir. And when Brandon died, this boy became the next Lord of Winterfell. Years later, when Bael led a wildling army south, and the new Lord Stark rode out to face him, he found himself fighting his own father. The story ends with the Lord killing Bael in battle, and then, overcome with grief at what he had done, taking his own life. Whether this tale is true or mere legend, it illustrates an important truth about House Stark. Their survival often hung by a thread. Unlike southern houses that might have many branches and cadet lines, the Starks put all their hopes on the direct line of succession from father to son. When that line was threatened, when heirs were scarce, the very future of the house was in jeopardy. This would prove to be both a source of strength, keeping the family united and the line of succession clear, and a vulnerability that enemies might exploit. As the centuries turned into millennia, the kings of winter became legendary figures, not just in the north, but throughout Westeros. They had succeeded in maintaining their independence and their ancient customs, even as the Andal invasion swept through the southern kingdoms, replacing the First Men dynasties with new rulers who worshipped the Seven instead of the old gods. The north remained a bastion of the old ways, its people following the gods of forest and stream, maintaining traditions that stretched back to the dawn of humanity in Westeros. During this golden age, if such it can be called in the harsh and unforgiving north, the kings of winter ruled with an iron hand tempered by winter's wisdom. They had to be hard, for the north was hard. They had to be strong, for weakness meant death when winter came. But they also had to be just, for the small folk and lords alike had to trust that the direwolf of Winterfell would protect them, would provide for them, would lead them through the darkness of winter into the light of spring once more. Not all the tales from this age are heroic. One of the most disturbing legends concerns a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, known only as the Night's King. According to the stories told by Old Nan and other storytellers in the north, this Night's King was once a Stark of Winterfell, a younger brother to the King of Winter, whose name was Brandon. He rose to become the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and during a ranging beyond the wall, he saw a woman with skin as white as the moon, and eyes like blue stars. Some say she was one of the others, or perhaps something else equally terrible and beautiful. The Night's King fell in love with this creature, and when he brought her back to the Night Fort, the largest castle along the wall, he declared himself king and her his queen. For 13 years, the Night's King ruled from the Night Fort with his corpse queen at his side, performing dark rituals and making sacrifices to the others. The Night's Watch, sworn to protect the realms of men, became instead a force of terror under his command. It was only when Brandon the Breaker, a king of winter, joined forces with Joramun, the king beyond the wall, that the Night's King was finally defeated and cast down. After his defeat, his very name was forbidden to be spoken, stricken from the records, so that his evil would not be remembered or honored. This tale, if it has any truth to it at all, suggests that House Stark's connection to the others and to the darkness beyond the wall goes deeper than simple enmity. Perhaps there is old magic in the Stark blood, magic that connects them to the ancient powers of ice and winter, magic that can be used for good or twisted to evil, depending on the man who wields it. This theme of Starks being drawn to darkness, of having to resist the call of winter, would echo through their history in ways both subtle and profound. The later centuries of the Age of Kings saw other notable rulers from Winterfell. Brandon the Shipwright, dreaming of what lay across the Sunset Sea to the west, built a great fleet to explore those unknown waters. He sailed west with his ships and was never seen again, vanishing into the mystery of the Western Ocean. His son, also named Brandon, was so distraught by his father's disappearance that he became Brandon the Burner, and in his grief and rage, he burned every ship in the northern harbours and shipyards. From that day forward, the North had no strength at sea, a weakness that would plague them when dealing with the Ironborn raiders in later ages. King Doran Stark reigned in an age when giants still walked the North, and the children of the forest could still be found in the deepest woods. Stories claim that Doran's champion, a warrior named Redwyn, fought and slew giants, and that Doran himself traded with the children, maintaining the ancient friendship between men and the first inhabitants of Westeros. By his time, both giants and children were already fading, retreating into the wild places, but they had not yet vanished entirely from the world. Brandon the Ninth Stark earned fame by destroying the ships of the rebellious wildlings on Skagos, that mysterious island to the northeast where cannibals and unicorns were said to dwell. The Skagsea had always been difficult to control, more wildling than Northmen in their ways, and Brandon's campaign to bring them back under Winterfell's authority would be remembered as particularly brutal. Throughout these centuries, the kings of winter waged endless wars against threats from all sides. The wildlings from beyond the wall raided constantly, forcing the kings to send men and supplies to reinforce the Night's Watch. The Ironborn from the Iron Islands launched their longships to raid the western coast, carrying off plunder and thralls. The kings of winter responded with fire and sword, driving the Ironborn from their settlements on the mainland again and again, though they could never strike at the Iron Islands themselves without the ships that Brandon the Burner had destroyed. The crypts beneath Winterfell filled with the dead, level after level, descending deep into darkness. Each king of winter was given a stone statue sitting beside his tomb, a sword of iron across his lap, and a direwolf at his feet. The oldest crypts at the deepest levels became places of shadow and fear, where even the bravest men hesitated to venture. The ancient kings slept in darkness, their swords rusted, their wolves crumbling, their names sometimes forgotten, but their presence still felt by all who walked the halls above. Winter after winter came and went. Some were short, lasting only a year or two. Others were long and terrible, lasting a decade or more, killing the weak and testing the strong. Each time, the Starks led their people through the darkness, rationing supplies, making hard decisions about who would survive and who would not, maintaining order when desperation might have led to chaos. They earned their reputation as the Lords of Winter, the Masters of the North, the house that would endure no matter how hard the wind blew or how deep the snow fell. Their culture became distinct from the rest of Westeros. While the South adopted the 7 gods brought by the Andals, the North kept faith with the old gods, praying before heart trees in Godswoods, listening to the wind in the leaves for answers to their prayers. While Southern knights fought for glory and wore elaborate armor, Northern warriors fought with practical efficiency, wearing furs and leather, wielding axes and hammers alongside their swords. While Southern lords built bright castles and threw elaborate feasts, the Northern lords fortified their holdings against winter and conserved their resources. knowing that lean times always came. And through it all, through thousands of years of history, House Stark endured. Sons followed fathers, kings followed kings. The line never broke. The succession was sometimes contested, sometimes uncertain, but it never failed. There was always a Stark in Winterfell, always a direwolf on the throne of the kings of winter, always someone to speak those ancient words. Winter is coming. For 8,000 years, give or take the inaccuracies of ancient records, House Stark had ruled as kings in the north, bending knee to no one, master of all between the wall and the neck. They had maintained their independence through the age of heroes, through the coming of the Andals, through every crisis and conflict that had swept across Westeros. They were one of the last bastions of the First Men's culture, one of the last ancient dynasties to rule unbroken from time immemorial. And then came Aegon Targaryen and his dragons, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the year now known as Barnpurs AC, Aegon the Conqueror landed on the eastern shore of Westeros with his 2 sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, and 3 dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes. These were the last dragons in the world, survivors of the doom of Valyria, and they were the most powerful weapons that had ever been seen in Westeros. Aegon's ambition was simple and staggering. He would conquer all of Westeros and forge the 7 kingdoms into one united realm under his rule. The southern kingdoms fell one by one. At the Field of Fire, Aegon and his sisters unleashed all 3 dragons against the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands, burning 4,000 men alive and utterly destroying the mightiest host ever assembled in Westeros. King Harren the Black, who had built his massive castle of Harrenhal believing its thick walls could withstand any assault, learned that stone walls meant nothing when Balerion's fire could melt rock itself. Housegardener was extinguished entirely when King Mern and all his heirs died in the flames at the Field of Fire. The other kingdoms saw what resistance meant and chose submission instead. In the north, Torrhen Stark, king in the north, called his banners. The distance was vast, and it took time for the word to spread, for the lords to gather their men, for the great host of the north to assemble. By the time Torrhen led his army of 30,000 southward, crossing the neck and entering the Riverlands, Aegon had already conquered most of the south. But Torrhen marched on regardless, determined to meet this conqueror and decide the fate of his kingdom. The 2 armies met at the Trident, that great river that flows through the heart of the Riverlands. On the southern bank waited Aegon with an army some 45,000 strong, including men from all the kingdoms he had already conquered. Forces from the Riverlands, the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Westerlands. And circling overhead, like death itself made, manifest, were 3 dragons. On the northern bank stood Torrhen and his 30,000 Northmen, the greatest army the North had fielded in generations. Torrhen Stark was no fool. His scouts had seen the ruins of Harrenhal, where the stone itself had melted like wax. Word had reached him of the Field of Fire, where men had burned in their armor, where the heat had been so intense that swords and spears melted. He knew what his men faced if he ordered them to cross the river and give battle. That night, King Torrhen called a council of all his lords and advisors. Some wanted to fight, trusting in northern valor and the courage of their men to somehow triumph over dragons. These were the hot-blooded ones, the proud ones, who would rather die fighting than bend the knee to a foreign invader. Others suggested withdrawing to Moat Cailin, that ancient fortress at the southern edge of the neck, where the terrain would negate the advantage of dragons, and where the Starks could make a stand that Aegon would find impossible to overcome. This had a certain wisdom to it. The causeway through the neck was narrow and treacherous, and Moat Cailin had never fallen to a southern army. Torrhen's bastard half-brother, Brandon Snow, offered the most desperate and daring plan. He volunteered to cross the Trident in darkness, sneak into Aegon's camp, and assassinate the dragons as they slept, or at least their riders. If he could kill Aegon and his sisters, the dragons might be rendered useless or at least leaderless, and the northern army could triumph in the chaos that followed. It was a suicide mission, but Brandon was willing to attempt it if his brother commanded. Torrhen listened to all these counsels and made his decision. The next morning, he sent Brandon Snow, accompanied by 3 maesters, to Aegon's camp under a banner of parley. Messages were exchanged, terms were discussed, and then, on the morning after, King Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident, walked to where Aegon Targaryen waited, and knelt. He laid his ancient crown, the crown of the Kings of Winter that had been worn by his ancestors for thousands of years, at Aegon's feet. He swore fealty to Aegon as the King of the 7 Kingdoms, and in return, Aegon named him Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. From that day forward, Torrhen Stark has been known by 2 names: Lord Torrhen to those who honour his decision, and the King who knelt to those who question it. But there is one indisputable fact about Torrhen's choice. No Northman died on the Trident. No noble houses were extinguished. No castles were burned. No swords were melted down for Aegon's Iron Throne. The North remained intact, its people alive, its lords in their keeps, its customs unchanged. Torrhen had chosen survival over pride, the lives of his men over his own glory, the future of his house over the crown he wore. Not everyone agreed with his choice. After Torrhen's surrender, a group of northern warriors, refusing to bend the knee to the Targaryens, formed a sellsword company called the Company of the Rose and went into exile across the narrow sea. Torrhen's own sons spoke of rebellion, of raising the Stark banner and declaring independence once more. But Torrhen held firm, and eventually his sons, seeing the wisdom in their father's choice, or simply recognizing they had no alternative, accepted Targaryen rule. To bind the realm together, Queen Rhaenys Targaryen arranged a marriage between Torrhen's daughter and Ronald Arryn, the young lord of the Eyrie. This alliance was meant to help integrate the North into the new 7 kingdoms, to create bonds of blood and marriage between regions that had been enemies. Torrhen agreed, though letters preserved at the Citadel suggest he did so only after much protest, and that his sons refused to attend the wedding. Such was their lingering resentment of the conquest. As a reward for his submission and his service, Aegon relied upon Torrhen to help pacify the realm. When the sister men of the 3 sisters rose in rebellion under Queen Marla Sunderland, it was Torrhen who sent Sir Warwick Manderley with ships from White Harbour to crush the uprising. When Aegon needed longships to invade the Iron Islands, it was Torrhen who provided them, sending warriors from Bear Island to fight alongside the Targaryen forces. And so ended the age of the Kings of Winter. The crown that had been worn for 8,000 years was given up without a battle. The independence that had been maintained against all threats and all enemies was surrendered to preserve the people of the North. House Stark remained powerful, perhaps even more powerful than before as Warden of the North, but they were no longer kings. They were subjects, vassals of the Iron Throne, bound by oath and honor to serve whoever sat upon that throne, whether they deserved that service or not. The 3 centuries of Targaryen rule over Westeros were, for House Stark, a time of consolidation and adjustment. They ruled the North as they always had, managing their bannermen, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and preparing their people for the winters that came and went. But now they also had obligations to the South, to the Iron Throne, to kings who sat in King's Landing rather than Winterfell. It was a delicate balance, maintaining northern independence in spirit while acknowledging southern sovereignty in fact. The early Targaryen kings generally left the north to its own devices. As long as taxes were paid and levies were provided when needed, the lords of Winterfell were free to govern as they saw fit. This arrangement suited both parties. The Targaryens had little interest in the frozen north with its ancient trees and old gods, and the Starks had little interest in southern politics. The distance between King's Landing and Winterfell was vast, and the journey difficult, especially in winter. Lords of Winterfell rarely travelled south unless summoned, and Targaryen kings rarely travelled north unless some pressing matter demanded it. There were exceptions, of course. During the reign of Jaehaerys I, known as the Conciliator, and one of the greatest Targaryen kings, he and his sister wife Queen Alysanne made a famous royal progress through the north. This visit left a lasting impression on the region and on the relationship between House Stark and House Targaryen. Lord Alaric Stark played host to the king and queen at Winterfell, showing them northern hospitality and the ancient customs of his people. Queen Alysanne was particularly fascinated by the north and its mysteries. She flew her dragon, Silverwing, to the wall to see that ancient barrier with her own eyes. But something strange happened when she attempted to fly beyond the wall. 3 times she tried, and 3 times Silverwing refused to cross, turning back south despite Alysanne's commands. The queen later wrote to Jaehaerys about her unease, noting that even her dragon seemed to fear whatever lay beyond that icy barrier. She also requested and received historical documents about the wall from the Night's Watch and Winterfell's archives, seeking to understand the ancient threat that had necessitated its construction. During this visit, Alysanne advocated for the Night's Watch, and her efforts led to additional lands being granted to the Order, a stretch of territory called the New Gift that doubled the lands available to support the Black Brothers. She also convinced Jaehaerys to fund the construction of a new road from Winterfell to the Wall, making communication and travel between the North and the Wall much easier. These actions earned the Targaryens great goodwill in the North, and the memory of good Queen Alysanne would remain warm for generations. When the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons, erupted during the reign of King Viserys I, House Stark was drawn into southern conflicts as never before. The succession was disputed between Viserys' daughter Rhaenyra and his son Aegon II. Lord Cregan Stark, one of the most formidable lords of Winterfell in the Targaryen era, declared for Rhaenyra, honouring the oath his father had sworn to uphold her claim. Cregan led a great host of northern soldiers, called the Winter Wolves, because many were older men who sought glory in their final years to fight for Rhaenyra's cause. By the time the Northmen reached the south, much of the conflict was already over, both Rhaenyra and Aegon dead, but Cregan's arrival in King's Landing was still momentous. He served briefly as Hand of the King and oversaw the trials and executions of many who had committed crimes during the war. His time in the south was marked by rough justice and no-nonsense governance, very much in the northern style, and he became known for his strength and his honour, before returning home to Winterfell. The participation in the Dance of the Dragons cost the North dearly in men and resources, and it reinforced the lesson that southern conflicts brought only grief to those who became entangled in them. The lords of Winterfell who followed would be more reluctant to involve the North in the intrigues of the South, understanding that what happened in King's Landing rarely benefited the people of the North. As the Targaryen dynasty continued, some lords of Winterfell maintained close relations with the Iron Throne, while others kept their distance. All maintained the traditions of the North, the worship of the old gods, the stark sense of honor and duty that defined House Stark. They buried their dead in the crypts beneath Winterfell, erected statues even though they were no longer kings, and taught their children that winter was always coming and that they must always be prepared. The words "winter is coming" took on new layers of meaning during these years. They were still a warning about the physical reality of winter, of course, but they also became a reminder to remain vigilant, to remember who they were and where they came from, to never become soft or complacent like the Southerners who did not face the harsh realities that the North endured. Every generation of Starks learned that lesson anew. If there is a single point in the long history of House Stark that changed everything, that set in motion events whose consequences would echo for decades, it was the year of the Fall Spring and the tragedy that followed. This is where our tale becomes most painful, most personal, and where we see the honor and duty of House Stark tested to breaking. In the year 281 AC, a great tourney was held at Harrenhal, that cursed castle built by Harren the Black and melted by dragonfire. It was attended by lords and ladies from across the Seven Kingdoms, one of the grandest gatherings in living memory. Among those in attendance were members of House Stark, Lord Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, along with 3 of his 4 children. There was Brandon Stark, the eldest son and heir, a fierce and headstrong young man already betrothed to Catelyn Tully. There was Eddard Stark, the second son, called Ned, a quieter and more thoughtful young man, who was fostered at the Vale under Lord Jon Arryn. And there was Lyanna Stark, the only daughter, a beauty with a wild spirit, betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, and Eddard's close friend from their time in the Vale. The tourney was magnificent, with knights from across the realm competing for glory. But its ending would be remembered not for the jousting or the feasting, but for a single moment that, as Ned would later recall, was the moment when all the smiles died. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, had won the tournament. Tradition held that he should crown his wife, Princess Elia Martell, as the Queen of Love and Beauty. Instead, Rhaegar rode past Elia and placed a crown of winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap. The crowd fell silent. What did this mean? Was it merely a gesture of courtly love, a compliment to a beautiful woman, or was it something more? Robert Baratheon was enraged, seeing his betrothed honored by another man. Eddard Stark was deeply concerned, recognizing that nothing good could come from the heir to the throne publicly showing such favor to a woman betrothed to another. Even King Aerys, already descending into the madness that would define his later years, took note and was displeased. What happened next remains a matter of debate and confusion even centuries later. According to the official story, Prince Rhaegar abducted Lyanna Stark. She disappeared from wherever she was staying, and when the news reached Brandon Stark, he was riding toward River Run for his wedding to Catelyn Tully. Brandon, hot-headed and brave, immediately turned his horse south toward King's Landing. with a group of young lords accompanying him, including Ethan Glover, Geoffrey Mallister, Kyle Royce, and Elbert Arryn. Brandon rode to the Red Keep and demanded that Rhaegar come out and face him, shouting that Rhaegar was a kidnapper and would die for his crimes. This was foolish beyond measure, but Brandon was young and in love and furious, thinking only of his sister's honor. King Aerys, always paranoid and cruel, saw this not as a young man's rage, but as an act of rebellion. He had Brandon and his companions arrested. Then he sent word to their fathers, including Rickard Stark, demanding they come to King's Landing to answer for their son's crimes. Lord Rickard Stark came to King's Landing as honor demanded. He came believing he would stand trial, that he could defend his actions and his son's actions before the king and the assembled lords. What he found instead was madness incarnate. King Aerys, in his paranoia and cruelty, declared that the trial would be by combat. Lord Rickard would fight for his innocence, and his champion would be fire. They suspended Rickard from the rafters of the throne room in his armor and lit a fire beneath him. As Rickard roasted alive in his armor, Brandon was brought in with a leather cord around his neck, attached to a device just out of reach. Brandon was told that if he could reach the sword nearby, he could cut his father down. Brandon strangled himself trying to reach it, struggling and fighting as his father burned, until the life went out of him. 2 Starks dead in the throne room, murdered by their own king in a mockery of justice, before the eyes of the entire court. But Aerys was not finished. He demanded that Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale, send him the heads of his 2 wards, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. If Aerys had stopped after killing Rickard and Brandon, he might have gotten away with it, might have cowed the lords of Westeros into accepting his actions. But by demanding the deaths of Robert and Eddard, he forced Jon Arryn to choose between his honor to his king and his honor to his wards. Lord Arryn chose his wards. He called his banners and declared rebellion. Thus began Robert's rebellion, also called the War of the Usurper by those loyal to the Targaryens. Eddard Stark, now Lord of Winterfell by the murder of his father and brother, called the banners of the North. He made the perilous journey from the Vale to the north, crossing the mountains of the Moon and hiring a fisherman to take him across the Bight to White Harbour. The fisherman drowned in a storm, but his daughter brought Ned to the 3 sisters, where the local lord had to decide whether to turn Ned over to the king for reward or let him continue north. The lord chose to let Ned go, betting correctly that the rebellion would succeed. Ned reached Winterfell and called his lords. The north rose in fury at the murder of its lord and his heir. An army marched south, and Ned led them to war, arriving with Hoster Tully's forces at the Battle of the Bells, where they saved Robert Baratheon from the forces of Lord Connington. To seal the alliance between the rebels, Eddard married Catelyn Tully, honouring his dead brother's betrothal, and Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully. The war raged for close to a year. Northern forces fought with distinction at multiple battles, most notably at the Trident, where Robert Baratheon faced Prince Rhaegar in single combat and killed him with his warhammer, smashing the Dragon Prince's ruby-encrusted breastplate and scattering the rubies into the river. With Rhaegar dead, the Targaryen cause was doomed. Lord Tywin Lannister, who had remained neutral throughout the war, suddenly declared for Robert and raced to King's Landing. His men were allowed into the city on the pretense of defending it, but instead they sacked it, murdering, looting, and raping. When Eddard Stark arrived at King's Landing with the main body of the rebel army, he found Tywin's men had already taken the city. He rode into the Red Keep and found King Aerys dead at the base of the Iron Throne, his throat slit, his blood pooling on the floor. Sitting on the throne itself, holding a bloody sword, was Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard, a young knight who had just killed the king he was sworn to protect. The bodies of Princess Elia Martell and her children, Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, had been brutally murdered by Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch at Tywin's command. The babies were wrapped in Lannister red cloaks and presented to Robert as trophies. Eddard was horrified. This was not the honourable war he had fought. This was butchery and murder and dishonour. He argued bitterly with Robert about the deaths of the children, seeing in this crime a stain on the rebellion's cause that could never be washed clean. Their friendship was strained to breaking, but ultimately it held, though it would never be quite the same. But there was one more tragedy yet to unfold. Lyanna Stark was not in King's Landing. She was in Dorne, at a place called the Tower of Joy, guarded by 3 knights of the Kingsguard: Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, Sir Oswell Went, and Lord Commander Sir Gerald Hightower. Eddard rode south with 6 companions, including his friend Howland Reed of Greywater Watch, to find his sister. What happened at the Tower of Joy became the stuff of legend and mystery. The 7 fought against 3 of the greatest warriors in the realm. When it was over, only Eddard and Howland Reed survived. All 3 Kingsguard were dead, including the legendary Sir Arthur Dayne, who many considered the finest knight of his generation. But even in victory, Eddard found only sorrow. Lyanna Stark was dying in a bed of blood, lying in a room that smelled of roses and grief. She was feverish, in pain, and she made her brother promise her something. Though what that promise was, Eddard never told another soul. "Promise me, Ned," she said, and he promised. Then she died, and Eddard built 8 cairns of stone in the Dornish mountains, 1 for his sister and 1 for each of his 6 fallen companions. When Eddard returned to Winterfell, he brought with him an infant boy that he claimed as his bastard son, naming him Jon Snow. He would never speak of the boy's mother, not even to his wife Catelyn, though some claimed she was a woman named Wylla. The presence of this bastard in Winterfell, raised alongside his true-born children, would be a source of pain and conflict for Catelyn, a stain on Ned's honour that she could never understand. The truth, the secret that Eddard Stark kept for the rest of his life, was that Jon Snow was not his son at all. Jon was the child of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born in that tower, the product of a love or an abduction, depending on whose version of events you believed. Eddard had promised his dying sister to protect the boy, knowing that if Robert ever learned that a male heir of Rhaegar lived, the child would be killed immediately. So Eddard did the only thing he could do. He claimed Jon as his bastard, allowing his own honour to be stained, allowing his wife to resent him, protecting the boy at any cost, keeping the promise he had made to Lyanna with her dying breath. Robert Baratheon became king, founding a new dynasty. Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell as Warden of the North, raised his family, and rarely left his frozen domain. The scars of the rebellion never fully healed. Brandon and Lyanna were dead, buried in the crypts beneath Winterfell, where Ned had statues carved for them, though they were not lords of Winterfell, breaking tradition to honour their memory. Rickard lay beside them, 3 Starks who should never have died, 3 lives cut short by the madness of a king and the tragedy of events no one could have prevented or predicted. For 15 years after Robert's rebellion, Eddard Stark ruled the North in relative peace. He was a good lord, just and fair, strict but not cruel, commanding respect and loyalty from his bannermen through his unwavering adherence to honour and duty. He was not a perfect man, no one is, but he was a good man in a world where good men often finished last or dead. His story, and the stories of his children, would define House Stark's role in the tumultuous events that followed. Ned's marriage to Catelyn Tully began under difficult circumstances, as it was originally meant for Brandon, but they built something real and lasting from that awkward foundation. Catelyn gave him 5 true-born children, Robb, the heir, born at River Run, while Ned was still at war, Sansa, beautiful and proper, Arya, wild and brave, Bran, curious and adventurous, and Rickon, the youngest, still a small boy when our story reaches its crisis. Jon Snow was raised alongside his supposed half-siblings, though Catelyn could never accept him and made her displeasure known. Jon and Robb became as close as true brothers, but Jon always felt the sting of bastardy, knowing he could never inherit Winterfell, never be a true Stark no matter how much Ned loved him. Ned treated Theon Greyjoy, taken as a ward after the failed Greyjoy rebellion, with distant kindness, though Theon always felt more like a hostage than a member of the family. Ned taught his children the lessons he had learned, the values that defined House Stark. He taught them that honor matters, that duty comes before desire, that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, that the North remembers, and that winter is always coming. He took them to see executions so they would understand the weight of justice. He let them find direwolf pups, one for each child, recognizing the omen even if he didn't fully understand its meaning. He prepared them as best he could for a world that would prove far more dangerous and cruel than he could have imagined. In the year 289 AC, Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, declared independence from the Iron Throne and crowned himself king. Robert Baratheon called his banners, and Ned led northern forces south to put down the rebellion. The war was short and brutal, ending with the destruction of the Greyjoy fleet and the siege of Pike. Balon surrendered, and as assurance of his future loyalty, his last surviving son, young Theon, was taken by Ned to Winterfell as a ward. This was the last time Ned saw Robert for 9 years, the last time he left the North until the king came to Winterfell and changed everything. Those 9 years were good years for House Stark. The North prospered under Ned's just rule. His children grew strong and healthy. Winterfell's granaries were full, its walls were strong, its people were content. Ned administered justice, settled disputes, collected taxes, and prepared for winter as his ancestors had done for 8,000 years. He was content to remain in the North, far from the intrigues of the South, far from the politics and dangers of King's Landing. He had no ambition beyond protecting his family and serving his people. But in the year 298 AC, word came that Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, was dead. Ned received a letter from his wife's sister, Lisa Arryn, claiming that the Lannisters had murdered Jon. And then came Robert Baratheon himself, riding north with half the court, to ask his old friend to leave Winterfell and become the new Hand of the King. Ned did not want to go. Every instinct told him that nothing good could come from entangling himself in southern politics. But Robert was his king and his friend, and when the king asks, a subject cannot easily refuse. Catelyn urged him to accept, seeing it as an honor and an opportunity to forge an alliance between their families by betrothing Sansa to Robert's eldest son, Prince Joffrey. Against his better judgment, Ned agreed. He rode south with his daughters, Sansa and Arya, leaving Robb to rule Winterfell in his absence, leaving Catelyn to advise Robb, leaving the North in capable hands. He could not have known that he was riding to his death, that this decision would shatter his family, would plunge the realm into war, would begin a chain of events whose consequences would reshape the entire political landscape of Westeros. In King's Landing, Ned found himself in a nest of vipers. Queen Cersei Lannister, beautiful and ruthless, was nothing like the women of the North. Her brother Jaime, the Kingslayer, wore his dishonor like a badge of pride. Her other brother Tyrion, the dwarf called the Imp, was far more clever and dangerous than his size suggested. Lord Petyr Baelish, called Littlefinger, who had grown up with Catelyn and her sister, turned out to be a master manipulator working for his own advancement. Lord Varys, the eunuch spy master, played his own games with his own goals. Ned began to investigate the circumstances of Jon Arryn's death and discovered that Jon had been looking into the parentage of King Robert's children. Following the same trail, Ned made a terrible discovery. Prince Joffrey, Princess Myrcella, and Prince Tommen were not Robert's children at all, but the product of an incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. Every child with golden Lannister hair, and not a single one with the black hair that was the dominant Baratheon trait. Before Ned could act on this knowledge, tragedy struck. Catelyn had come south after receiving Tyrion Lannister on the road and taking him prisoner, believing he was responsible for an attempt on Bran's life. This set off a war between Stark and Lannister, with Tywin Lannister invading the Riverlands in retaliation. Then Robert was mortally wounded in a hunting accident, almost certainly arranged by Cersei. On his deathbed, Robert named Ned Protector of the Realm until his son Joffrey came of age. Ned, ever honourable, tried to do the right thing. He approached Cersei privately, giving her a chance to flee with her children before he revealed the truth about Joffrey's parentage. This was mercy, but it was also foolishness, giving his enemy time to prepare. When Robert died, and Ned tried to reveal the truth and place Robert's brother Stannis on the throne as the rightful heir, Cersei struck first. The City Watch, which Ned thought he could trust, turned on him. Littlefinger betrayed him. Ned was arrested for treason. In the throne room, before the assembled court, young King Joffrey, as cruel and mad as his grandfather Aerys in his own way, demanded that Ned confess his treason. Ned promised that if he confessed, his life would be spared and he would be allowed to take the Black and join the Night's Watch, did what he thought he must to protect his daughters. He confessed, called himself a traitor, and asked for mercy. Joffrey promised mercy. Cersei and the entire court expected he would be merciful, that Ned would be sent to the wall, that this would end the conflict. But Joffrey, showing the sadistic streak that would define his reign, declared that mercy was for the weak. He commanded Sir Ilyn Payne to bring him Ned Stark's head, in front of his daughter Sansa, in front of the assembled nobility of Westeros, on the steps of the great Sept of Baelor. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Hand of the King, was forced to his knees. Sir Ilyn drew ice, Ned's own ancestral greatsword, and with one stroke severed Eddard's head from his shoulders. The Honourable Ned Stark was dead, executed for the crime of trying to do the right thing, murdered by the very system of justice and law he had always upheld. His death shocked the entire realm and lit the fires of war that would consume Westeros for years to come. news of Eddard Stark's execution reached Winterfell like a thunderbolt, shattering the peace of the north and igniting a fury that had not been seen since Robert's rebellion. Robb Stark, who had been ruling Winterfell in his father's absence, was now the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. He was 17 years old, barely a man by any reckoning, but he had no choice except to grow up immediately. His father had been murdered, his sisters were hostages in King's Landing, and the North demanded vengeance. Robb called the Banners, and the Banners answered. The Lords of the North had loved Ned Stark, had respected his honour and his justice, and they were willing to follow his son into war. The great Jon Umber, Lord Rickard Karstark, Rose Bolton of the Dreadfort, Mage Mormont of Bear Island, and dozens of other lords great and small rode to Winterfell with their men. An army assembled, thousands strong, ready to march south and rescue Ned, not yet knowing that they came too late. When word reached them that Ned was dead, that Joffrey had executed him, the fury of the North became something primal and unstoppable. But the question remained, what were they fighting for? Some wanted simple revenge, to kill Lannisters and burn their lands and make them pay for what they had done. Others saw this as an opportunity to break free from Southern rule once and for all. Robb's mother, Catelyn Stark, had gone south to be with Ned, leaving Winterfell in Robb's care. When she was released after Ned's death, she joined Robb and his army as they marched south. But the Lords of the North were making their own plans. Led by the great Jon Umber, who had been the first to draw steel in Robb's defence and had lost 2 fingers to Robb's direwolf Grey Wind for his trouble, the Northern Lords declared that they would have no more Southern kings. They would have a king in the North, as in the old days, as before the dragon came. They acclaimed Robb as their king, and one by one, the lords knelt before him and swore their oaths. King Robb Stark, the king in the North, the first to hold that title since Torrhen Stark bent the knee 3 centuries before. It was glorious and terrifying and doomed from the start, though none of them could see it then. Robb was young, talented and brave, a skilled commander despite his youth, and he won victory after victory. At the Battle of Whispering Wood, he captured Jaime Lannister himself, the Great Knight and Kingslayer. At the Battle of the Camps, he destroyed another Lannister army. He earned the nickname the Young Wolf, and songs were written about his prowess in battle. The Lords of the Riverlands, whose lands were being ravaged by the Lannisters, also declared for Robb, naming him King of the Trident as well as King in the North. This alliance was sealed when Catelyn negotiated safe passage across the Twins, the strategic crossing of the Green Fork controlled by House Frey. Lord Walder Frey agreed to support Robb, but only if Robb would marry one of his many daughters or granddaughters, binding their houses together. Robb agreed, seeing no other choice, and the Northern army crossed the Twins to relieve the siege of River Run. For a time, everything seemed possible. Robb won battle after battle. He outmaneuvered Lord Tywin Lannister himself, the most accomplished commander in the realm. He freed River Run and pushed the Lannisters out of much of the Riverlands. His bannermen followed him with absolute loyalty, seeing in him the qualities of his father combined with a military genius that Ned had never possessed. Even his direwolf Grey Wind fought beside him in battle, tearing out the throats of enemies and terrifying the Lannister forces. But war is not won by battles alone. Politics, alliances, and strategy matter as much as swords and courage. And in these areas, young Robb, honourable like his father, would make mistakes that would prove fatal. The first mistake came when Robb fell in love. While recovering from wounds taken in battle at the Crag, the seat of House Westerling, Robb was tended to by Talisa Maega, a healer from Volantis. They fell in love, and in a moment of passion and grief, after learning that his younger brothers Bran and Rickon had supposedly been killed by Theon Greyjoy, Robb slept with Talisa. Bound by his honour, feeling he had wronged her, Robb married Talisa in secret, breaking his oath to marry a Frey. This was a catastrophic error. Lord Walder Frey, already a suspicious and vengeful man, withdrew his support from Robb's cause. 4,000 soldiers, critical to Robb's plans, were no longer available to him. The strategic advantage of the twins was lost, and more importantly, Robb had shown that he could break his word, that his honour was not absolute, that he could be swayed by love or desire. This was seen as weakness by some of his own bannermen. The second mistake came when Robb executed Rickard Karstark for murdering 2 Lannister prisoners who were distant cousins of Jaime and Cersei. Lord Rickard had committed this crime in revenge for his sons who had been killed in battle. But it was still murder, and Robb, following his father's principle that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, personally beheaded Rickard. This was just, but it was also politically disastrous. The Karstarks, one of the largest and most powerful houses that had declared for Robb, abandoned him and returned home. Half his army melted away overnight. Desperate to replace his losses and regain the Frey's support, Robb agreed to a proposal from Lord Walder. Robb's uncle, Edmure Tully, would marry one of Walder's daughters at the twins. This would atone for Robb's broken oath, would bring the Freys back into the alliance, and would allow Robb to continue his war. It seemed like a reasonable solution, a way to repair the damage and move forward. What Robb did not know was that Lord Walder Frey and Lord Roose Bolton, one of Robb's own bannermen, had secretly negotiated with Tywin Lannister. They would betray Robb, murder him and his followers, and in exchange would receive titles, lands, and the protection of the Iron Throne. Tywin, recognizing that he could not defeat Robb on the battlefield, chose to destroy him through treachery instead. And so Robb Stark, his pregnant wife Talisa, his mother Catelyn, and thousands of northern soldiers rode to the twins for what they believed would be a wedding and the renewal of their alliance with House Frey. Lord Walder welcomed them, gave them bread and salt as a sign of guest right, that sacred tradition of hospitality that promised safety to all who shared food under a host's roof. The wedding took place, and the feast began. Then the music changed. The musicians began to play The Rains of Castamere, the Lannister song about the destruction of House Rain, a warning to all who would defy them. Catelyn saw Roose Bolton smirking, noticed chainmail under his sleeve, and realized the truth a heartbeat too late. She tried to warn Robb, but the doors were already closing. The crossbowmen were already taking aim. What followed became known as the Red Wedding, one of the most shocking violations of sacred law in Westerosi history. Talisa was stabbed repeatedly in the stomach, killing her and her unborn child before Robb's eyes. Robb himself was shot with crossbow bolts, unable to defend himself or save his wife. Outside, in the camps, Bolton and Frey men turned on the northern soldiers, slaughtering them in their tents, drunk and unprepared for betrayal. Catelyn took Lord Walder's wife hostage, a young girl, and threatened to kill her if they did not let Robb go. But Walder Frey cared nothing for his wife, and Roose Bolton stepped forward and drove his sword into Robb's heart, saying words that would echo through history. the Lannisters send their regards. Robb Stark died in his mother's arms, betrayed by men he had trusted, murdered along with his wife and child, his bannermen slaughtered, his cause destroyed in a single night. Catelyn, in her grief and rage, killed Walder's wife and then had her own throat cut by one of the Freys. The northern army was destroyed. The king in the north was dead. The Freys desecrated Robb's body, cutting off his head and sewing on the head of his direwolf Grey Wind in its place, parading this abomination through the halls as a mockery. The young wolf had fallen, and with him fell the hopes of northern independence, the dreams of justice for Ned Stark, and the unity of House Stark itself. The Red Wedding destroyed the Stark army and killed the king in the north, but it did not destroy House Stark entirely. The surviving children, scattered across Westeros and beyond, endured their own trials and tribulations, their own journeys through darkness toward whatever light they might find. Each followed their own path, transformed by their experiences, becoming harder, stronger, more dangerous than they had ever been. Sansa Stark, the eldest daughter, had been living as a hostage in King's Landing since her father's arrest. She had been betrothed to Joffrey, but was cast aside when he chose to marry Margaery Tyrell instead. The Lannisters forced her to marry Tyrion, the imp, in an attempt to claim Winterfell through her. Tyrion treated her with kindness, never consummating the marriage, but Sansa remained a prisoner in all but name. She was tormented by Joffrey before his death, used as a pawn by everyone around her, taught harsh lessons about the difference between the songs and stories she had loved as a girl and the brutal reality of power and politics. After Joffrey's death, Petyr Baelish, who had been manipulating events from the shadows, smuggled Sansa out of King's Landing and took her to the Vale, where her aunt Lysa ruled as Lady of the Eyrie. But the Vale offered no sanctuary. Lysa, driven mad by jealousy and obsession with Littlefinger, tried to kill Sansa, and Littlefinger pushed Lysa to her death through the Moon Door. Sansa found herself under Littlefinger's protection, learning from one of the most dangerous players of the game how to survive, how to lie, how to manipulate. Eventually, Littlefinger arranged for Sansa to marry Ramsay Bolton, now legitimized an heir to the newly created Warden of the North. This marriage was perhaps the worst thing that ever happened to Sansa. Ramsay was a monster, sadistic and cruel beyond measure, who raped and tortured her systematically. But even this hell tempered Sansa, made her harder, taught her that she could endure things she never imagined possible. When she finally escaped Winterfell with Theon's help, jumping from the walls into snowdrifts below, she was no longer the naive girl who had dreamed of knights and princes. She had become a survivor, someone who understood that power was the only protection, that kindness was weakness unless backed by strength. Arya Stark, the younger daughter, had escaped King's Landing before her father's execution, smuggled out by Yoren of the Night's Watch, who was recruiting for the Wall. She spent years wandering the Riverlands, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand. Villages burned, small folk murdered, her brother Robb's forces and the Lannister armies both leaving devastation in their wake. She travelled with the Brotherhood without banners for a time, encountered the Hound who took her captive hoping to ransom her, and arrived at the Twins just in time to witness the aftermath of the Red Wedding. Unable to return home, with nowhere safe to go, Arya took ship to Braavos across the narrow sea. She sought out the House of Black and White, the temple of the many-faced god, and asked to be trained as a faceless man, one of the legendary assassins of Braavos. The training was brutal, requiring her to give up her identity, to become no one, to forget that she was Arya Stark of Winterfell. But Arya could never fully abandon who she was. She kept her sword, needle, hidden away, a connection to Jon and home. She kept her list of names, people she wanted to kill, people who had wronged her family. Eventually, Arya left the House of Black and White, taking some of their skills, but refusing to completely give up her identity. She returned to Westeros as something new, something dangerous. Not a lady, not a child, but a trained killer who could change her face, move unseen, and strike without warning. She was Arya Stark, and she was coming home. Brandon Stark, called Bran, had been crippled when Jaime Lannister pushed him from a tower window after Bran witnessed Jaime and Cersei in an incestuous embrace. Confined to bed or carried by Hodor, the massive simple-minded stable boy, Bran nonetheless had gifts that others lacked. He was a warg, able to enter the minds of animals, particularly his direwolf Summer. He had strange dreams, green sight, visions of the past and possible futures. When Winterfell fell to Theon Greyjoy, Bran and his younger brother Rickon were forced to flee. They were aided by Osha, a wildling woman, and by Meera and Jojen Reed, children of Howland Reed, who had fought beside Ned at the Tower of Joy. Jojen had dreamed of Bran and knew he had a destiny to fulfill. They travelled north, beyond the wall, seeking the three-eyed raven, a mysterious figure from Bran's visions. The journey was hard and dangerous, through the haunted forest, past ancient weirwood trees, into lands where the dead walked. Jojen died protecting Bran, but they reached their destination, a cave where an ancient being, the last Greenseer, waited. This figure, the three-eyed raven, had once been a Targaryen bastard named Brynden Rivers. He taught Bran to use his powers, to see through the eyes of the weirwoods, to witness the past, to understand the great conflict between the living and the dead that was coming. In time, Bran would become the three-eyed raven himself, taking on the role of living memory, able to see across time and space, understanding everything that had been and much of what would be. He was no longer just Brandon Stark. He was something more and something less than human, a bridge between the world of men and older, stranger powers. Rickon Stark, the youngest son, was too young to understand what was happening when his family fell apart. He fled Winterfell with Bran, but was eventually separated from him, sent with Osha to seek shelter with the Umbers, one of House Stark's most loyal bannermen. He lived in hiding for years, waiting for the day when he might return home. That day would come, but it would end in tragedy when Ramsay Bolton used him as bait to draw Jon Snow into battle, then murdered the boy before Jon's eyes with an arrow to the back. And Jon Snow, the bastard, the one who was not really a Stark at all, had his own journey. He had joined the Night's Watch before war broke out, taking vows to father no children, hold no lands, wear no crowns. He served at Castle Black, ranging beyond the wall, fighting wildlings and worse things. He rose through the ranks to become Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, the youngest in history, a position that required him to make hard decisions, to negotiate with wildlings, to prepare for threats that few others believed in. Jon was murdered by his own men for his decision to let the wildlings through the wall, stabbed repeatedly by brothers who believed he was betraying the Watch. But he was brought back to life through the magic of the Red Priestess Melisandre. Having died, his watch was ended, his vows fulfilled. Jon Snow was free to leave the wall, free to return to the world of the living, free to reclaim his heritage even though he did not yet know what that heritage truly was. By the year 300 AC, House Stark seemed destroyed beyond recovery. The Lord and his lady were dead, murdered at the Red Wedding. The daughters were missing, presumed dead or lost forever. The castle of Winterfell had been taken by the Boltons, who ruled the north as wardens through treachery and terror, flaying any who opposed them, consolidating their power with the backing of the Iron Throne. But the wolves were not dead. They were scattered, yes, changed, hardened by suffering and loss, but alive, and they were coming home. Sansa Stark escaped from Winterfell with Theon Greyjoy's help, the same Theon who had once taken Winterfell and betrayed the Starks, now broken by Ramsay's torture and seeking redemption. They fled north and by fortune or fate encountered Jon Snow and the wildlings he had brought south of the Wall. The reunion between Jon and Sansa was emotional and profound. They were the first Starks to reunite since the family had scattered years before. Together, they resolved to retake Winterfell from the Boltons and reclaim their home. But they had almost no army. The Northern Lords, beaten down by years of war and terrorized by Bolton cruelty, were reluctant to declare for House Stark again. Too many had lost sons and brothers at the Red Wedding. Too many feared the Boltons' wrath. Jon and Sansa travelled from castle to castle, seeking support, and have found it grudging at best. The wildlings would fight for Jon, but there were only a few thousand of them. Some houses, like the Mormonts of Bear Island, pledged their support despite having few soldiers to spare. Young Lyanna Mormont, a girl of 10 who ruled her house, gave Jon and Sansa 62 men, every fighter Bear Island could spare, and her words became famous. House Mormont remembers. The North remembers. We know no king but the king in the North, whose name is Stark. It would not be enough. Ramsay Bolton commanded thousands of soldiers, battle-hardened men who had helped him defeat Stannis Baratheon's army earlier. But Sansa had one more card to play. She sent a raven to Peter Baelish in the Vale, asking for his help. Baelish, who claimed to love Sansa and certainly wanted to possess her and use her for his own advancement, convinced the young Lord Robin Arryn to send the Knights of the Vale north to aid House Stark. The two armies met outside Winterfell in what would become known as the Battle of the Bastards. Ramsay, cruel and clever, baited Jon into a rage by murdering Rickon before Jon's eyes, then encircled the Stark forces in a trap of corpses and shields. The northern soldiers were being systematically slaughtered, pressed together so tightly they could barely breathe, let alone fight. Defeat seemed certain. Jon Snow himself was nearly crushed in the press of bodies, suffocating under the weight of the dying and the dead. Then the Knights of the Vale arrived, smashing into the Bolton lines, breaking their formation, turning certain defeat into victory. The Bolton forces routed. Ramsay fled to Winterfell, but Jon, Tormund Giant's Bane, and Wun the giant broke through the gates. In the chaos, Ramsay killed Wun with an arrow, but Jon beat Ramsay nearly to death with his fists before stopping himself and turning Ramsay over to Sansa for judgment. Sansa's justice was poetic. She locked Ramsay in the kennels with his own hounds, the same hounds he had starved and used to hunt and kill victims. She told him he would be forgotten, that his house would disappear, that even his name would fade. Then she let the hounds loose, and they tore him apart and ate him as he screamed. The monster of the Dreadfort was dead, and House Bolton was destroyed. Winterfell was retaken. The Stark banners flew once more over the ancient castle. Jon and Sansa stood in the hall where their father had ruled, where generations of Starks had lived and died. They had come home. the Northern Lords assembled at Winterfell to acknowledge the victory and decide what came next. Many wanted to acclaim Sansa as the Lady of Winterfell, recognizing her birthright. But young Lyanna Mormont stood again and spoke for Jon Snow. She reminded the Lords that Jon had called the banners when no other Stark could, that he had retaken Winterfell, that he was Ned Stark's son, bastard or not. Other lords joined their voices to hers, declaring that they had chosen the wrong king in Robb, that the North needed a strong leader, that blood mattered less than character and courage. And so, against Jon's protests, against his insistence that he was just a bastard, the Northern Lords acclaimed him as king in the North. Jon Snow, bastard-born, raised at Winterfell, but never truly belonging, the boy who had joined the Night's Watch to find a place where bastardy didn't matter, found himself crowned as his brother Robb had been years before. The North had a king again, and his name was Stark, or so everyone believed. But Jon and Sansa both knew that the war was not over. The Boltons were defeated, but the Lannisters still held the South. More importantly, the real threat was not political, but existential. The White Walkers, the others of legend, were marching south with an army of the dead. Jon had seen them, had fought them, knew that unless the living united to face this threat, nothing else would matter. No throne would matter. No house or kingdom would matter if the dead swept over the world. This knowledge would drive Jon's decisions in the months to come. Decisions that would prove controversial but necessary. Decisions that would ultimately determine not just the fate of the North, but the fate of all humanity. The final chapter of House Stark's ancient history is also the story of how the family nearly ended and yet somehow endured, how they faced threats that would have destroyed lesser houses and emerged changed but unbroken, how they adapted to a world that had transformed around them and found new purposes, new roles, new destinies. After Jon Snow was crowned king in the North, Sansa Stark became Lady of Winterfell, managing the castle and the North, while Jon dealt with the greater threats beyond their borders. The relationship between them was complicated. Sansa loved her brother, but also questioned his decisions, particularly when Jon chose to travel south to Dragonstone to meet with Daenerys Targaryen, the last scion of the house that had ruled Westeros for 3 centuries before Robert's rebellion. Daenerys had returned to Westeros from across the Narrow Sea with 3 dragons, an army of Unsullied, and the fierce loyalty of the Dothraki Horse Lords. She was the prophesied queen, the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, and she intended to reclaim the Iron Throne that had been her family's before Robert Baratheon stole it. But she also had dragons, and Jon needed dragons to fight the Night King and his army of the dead. The meeting between Jon and Daenerys was momentous in ways neither of them initially understood. They were drawn to each other, recognizing in one another a shared sense of duty and isolation. Jon bent the knee to Daenerys, acknowledging her as his queen in exchange for her promise to help fight the dead. This decision infuriated Sansa and the Northern Lords, who felt Jon had given away the independence they had fought so hard to reclaim. But Jon believed he had no choice. The threat of the dead trumped everything else. Meanwhile, other Starks were converging on Winterfell. Arya returned home after years away, a trained assassin who had exacted revenge on House Frey by poisoning all the male members of that treacherous house at a feast, personally cutting Walder Frey's throat after serving him a pie made from his own sons. She was no longer the girl who had left, and her reunion with Sansa was tense at first. complicated by years of separation and vastly different experiences. But ultimately, the sisters found their way back to each other, recognizing that family was what mattered most. Bran also returned, but he was changed beyond recognition. He was no longer Brandon Stark, not really. The three-eyed raven, able to see the past, present, and possible futures, emotionally detached, more knowledge than person. When he revealed to Jon the truth about Jon's parentage, that he was not Ned Stark's bastard, but the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, named Aegon Targaryen, Jon's entire understanding of himself was shattered. He was not a Snow. He was a Targaryen. He was, in fact, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, with a better claim than Daenerys herself. This revelation would have profound consequences, but before those consequences could fully unfold, the army of the dead arrived. The Night King, the first and greatest of the White Walkers, led his forces south. He had killed one of Daenerys' dragons and raised it as a white, using its ice-blue fire to destroy the wall at Eastwatch and march his army into the north. The living gathered at Winterfell for what would be called the Great War, or the Long Night. The castle's defences were prepared. Trenches were dug and filled with kindling. Dragon glass weapons, the only thing other than Valyrian steel that could kill White Walkers, were forged and distributed. Warriors from across Westeros came to fight. Northmen and wildlings, knights from the Vale, Daenerys' Unsullied and Dothraki. 2 dragons fought for the living. The greatest army ever assembled prepared to face the dead. The Battle of Winterfell was brutal beyond description. The Dothraki charged into darkness and were extinguished like candles in a wind. The dead came in waves, endless and unstoppable, climbing over each other to reach the living. Dragons fought in the sky, fire against ice. The defenders were driven back, overwhelmed, dying by the hundreds. The Night King came for Bran, knowing that killing the three-eyed raven would erase the memory of the world, would destroy the last link to the past and the hope for the future. He walked through the Godswood while his whites massacred the defenders. Theon Greyjoy died protecting Bran, finally finding redemption for his betrayal years before. The Night King approached Bran, raised his sword to strike, and then Arya Stark appeared as if from nowhere, leaping through the air with a Valyrian steel dagger. The Night King caught her by the throat, but Arya dropped the dagger and caught it with her other hand, driving it into his chest. The Night King shattered into ice. Every white he had raised, every White Walker he had created shattered with him. The army of the dead fell like puppets whose strings had been cut. The Great War was over, won not by armies or dragons, but by a young woman who had been trained to be no one and chose instead to be Arya Stark. But victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands had died. Winterfell was a charnel house. The joy of survival was tempered by grief for all those lost. And the conflicts among the living, which had been set aside to face the greater threat, now returned. Daenerys, having helped save the world, turned her attention to conquering it. She marched south to take King's Landing from Cersei Lannister. Jon Snow, conflicted by his duty to his queen and his love for her, by his own claim to the throne and his desire to avoid it, marched with her. When Daenerys, driven by grief and rage after the death of another dragon and her closest friend, burned King's Landing and massacred hundreds of thousands of innocents, Jon was forced to make the most difficult choice of his life. He killed Daenerys, stabbing her in the throne room of the Red Keep, preventing her from spreading her destruction to the rest of the world. It was murder, and it was necessary. An echo of Jaime Lannister killing Aerys years before. An honourable man doing a dishonourable thing to save the realm. Jon expected to die for this crime, but he was protected by the Stark name, by his allies, by the political complications of the moment. In the aftermath, the remaining lords of Westeros gathered to decide the future. Tyrion Lannister, imprisoned and awaiting execution, suggested that the age of hereditary monarchy should end, that the lords should choose their king. And in one of the stranger turns of fate, Bran Stark, who had no desire to rule, and indeed had no desires at all in the conventional sense, was chosen as Bran the Broken, king of the Six Kingdoms. 6, not 7, because Sansa Stark demanded independence for the North. After everything they had endured, after all the sacrifices they had made, the North would be free again. The other lords agreed, perhaps recognizing that the North had earned its freedom, perhaps simply tired of fighting. Sansa was crowned queen in the North, the first woman to rule the kingdom since the ancient age of heroes. Jon Snow, for killing Daenerys, was sentenced to rejoin the Night's Watch, to go north of the Wall and never return to the south. It was exile disguised as mercy. He left Winterfell one last time, saying goodbye to his sisters, to Sansa, who would rule the north, to Arya, who was leaving to sail west into unknown seas, seeking what lay beyond the edge of the map. Bran, going south to rule, could not join them, separated by duty and by his transformation into something beyond human. And so, the Starks scattered again, but this time not in defeat, but in triumph. They had endured everything the world could throw at them. They had survived betrayal, war, exile, and the literal apocalypse. They had lost members, but the house endured. Bran ruled the south. Sansa ruled the north. Arya sailed to new adventures. Jon lived beyond the wall with the free folk, finally finding a place where he belonged. House Stark's history, 8,000 years in the making, had led to this strange conclusion. Not destroyed, not defeated, but transformed, scattered across the world, holding power in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. And so we reach the end of our journey through the long, bitter, glorious history of House Stark. From Bran the Builder raising the wall in the dawn of history, to Sansa Stark, crowned as queen in the north in the modern age, we've traced the path of one family across 8,000 years. We've seen them rise from minor kings to rulers of the entire north. Watched them endure conquest and submission. Witnessed their near destruction and their miraculous survival. What can we take away from this epic tale? Perhaps it's that honor, while it may cost everything, is ultimately worth the price. Eddard Stark died because of his honor, but his children survived and triumphed because they carried that honor in their hearts, even when they had to bend it to survive. Perhaps it's that family endures when nothing else does. The Starks were scattered and broken, but they found their way back to each other, and that loyalty, that love, sustained them through the darkest times. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler and starker, like the land they come from. Winter always comes. Darkness always falls. Death is always waiting. But spring comes too. The sun rises. Life continues. And if you can endure the winter, if you can survive the darkness, if you can hold on through the longest night, then you might just live to see the dawn. The words of House Stark were never a boast or a threat. They were a warning, yes, but also a promise. Winter is coming, and we will be ready. Winter came, and they were ready. Winter came and went, and House Stark endured.